Welcome to episode 102 of the Daniel Yoris podcast with today's guest, Phil Wagner. Let's go. Welcome back to the podcast, everybody. Joined here today by Phil Wagner. Phil, thanks for being here. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Thanks, Daniel.
Phil, give us a quick rundown of who you are and what it is that you spend your time doing.
Yeah, so... Yeah,
Might not be a quick rundown, but...
Yeah, I think, right now I'm the CEO and founder at Sparta Science. So a lot of times, with innovation startups, the CEO role is kind of everything. So I'm fortunate enough to be able to be involved in a lot of different parts, from product side to, really the hiring side to a little bit of everything, but all kind of centers around this goal of, how can we help individuals move better? And, part of that is, certainly with athletes and performing at a higher level and limiting pain, but also, for folks as they age, how do we promote and help them by giving them a better idea, objective markers? Here's what you do well. Here's areas you can improve on, and really create a vital sign, if you will, for movement, just like heart rate or blood pressure.
What I love so much about my perception of what it is that you guys do since we've connected is that you're kind of coming at the whole movement optimization and movement health from the macro level, whereas someone like myself and other personal trainers, we're dealing with a single client at a time. And there's, of course, a time and a place for both of these. But I've often said here on the podcast, even like, my job shouldn't exist. We shouldn't have all of these movement problems, fully functioning society, but it's the macro issues that exist in our built environment that create these things. And so while I think we do need people like myself and other trainers and coaches, we also need people like you changing the macro outlook of how we move. So what is your real strategy about going against that? Because to me, that seems like an impossible task.
It's certainly difficult. And I think there's a lot of good examples out there in other areas. I mean, a good example is Apple Watch, in that they've, really expanded cardiovascular measurements and things that usually occur only in the lab. And it allows, individuals to have those objective markers, at home and just through everyday life. And they do that by crowdsourcing, right? All this information that's coming in from all these different people, because at the macro level, to your point, there's an access level to thousands and thousands of individuals with that approach. And so we kind of look at movement the same way, whether we look at a balance or a jump. How do we look at static or dynamic movement at a macro level and leverage, much like Apple, machine learning to put people into clusters or buckets and say, hey, this is how you move, right? And these are the things that support, not only your goals, but the way you move in terms of exercises. And the way we can come to some of these conclusions is by that crowdsourcing effort of gathering a lot of data from a lot of different people.
So what I gather from that is it would almost be putting people into buckets and say, like, okay, you present with XYZ movement patterns or movement deficiencies. So you are I call it a type 1 mover. And then someone else presents with ABC movement deficiencies. And so you are a type 2 mover, and there's, a couple of these buckets. And then we can use that to generalize prescriptive exercise and movement. Is that sort of an accurate representation?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think as practitioners, to your point, we don't have access to that macro level. And I think as a result, a lot of times we defer to the micro piece of, okay, let's test out your hamstrings. And, a good example, right? Test out your hamstrings. Hamstring weakness or strength may not be the cause of the hamstring injury, right? It could be an ankle dysfunction, right? It could be, the skill of your running technique, right? And so, the macro level can start giving more variables and insights into how the system functions as a whole. A good saying I always heard in medical school is, where it hurts, it ain't, right? So when we have that macro approach, we can see more of the system and how it relates to other people of your similar gender at birth or age or goals, occupation, whatever that may be.
I think a good way to even sum this up, and something that, similar to the way that I use in my own job, is that we have all these movement assessments, and there are tons of them out there, and they all have different names and different, whatever, testing and different things. And they sometimes get into the nitty gritty. Like if you fail this movement test, then it's because your right side, lower fibers of your rhomboid are weak. And it's like, okay, you can't possibly see that with your eye. And even if you could, you're going to do the same exercises with that person as you would anyone else. So it's almost like, yeah, we have these exercises, and they're almost more of a sales tactic, some of these movement screens. But then it's like, well, we're just going to squat, we're going to fix your squat, we're going to do pulls, we're going to fix your rows, we're going to do presses, we're going to fix your presses, and all the other things are going to kind of fall in place. But taking a more granular approach, almost with technology that can probably assess these things better than a trained human can, that's got to be better on a macro level, no?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you bring up a great point that the micro approach, is not only in the assessment, but also in the exercise. It's always funny when people say, oh yeah, squats are a quad exercise. Kind of, they are, right? Quads are involved, but it's not just the quads, right? There's, and so better to look at something like a squat as a movement pattern of squatting, right? Yeah. As opposed to, the micro level of which muscles are involved. Because to your point, unless you're sticking fine EMG needles deep into the muscles, you're really not going to know which muscles are truly being engaged and to what extent.
Yeah. And even just the patterning, someone say, you do a squat and your knees cave in. Okay, that means that your adductors are weak. And it's like, well, do you really know that? Because that's also, again, a generalization that is like maybe they are weak, but maybe there's also something else that's weak. Maybe there's an ankle like it could be any number of other things, but trainers, we've been taught, like, do the movement assessment, if X, then Y, and then tell that to the client, and then say, oh, client X, you are broken, therefore pay me for my services because I can fix you.
Yeah, I don't think that's that's a practitioner problem in general. We're all taught to think decision tree and concretely, right? And even as a physician, one of the biggest parts of my training was a big piece is to comfort the patient with a sense of conviction, right? So, same deal when working with athletes or in personal training is like, you want to convey this sense of conviction, but the challenge, to your point, is a lot of it may not be entirely accurate and could be a fair amount of assumptions.
Right. Yeah, I think it's a good point, though, to say that you do need to deliver it with a conviction, and it's probably even more true with athletes. If you're in a room full of football players and you're giving like the hum and haw answer, like they're not really going to buy in. Like you're already in like the alpha. You have to be the alpha dog of all the alpha dogs if you're the coach, and you've got to get them to buy in. And so that's might be a little bit different than with a patient who's dealing with a hip issue or something like that, where you're not trying to motivate them and rile them up. Your athletes, you just kind of need them to do what you need them to do, but they still need to have confidence in you as the doctor or practitioner or what have you.
Correct. Yeah, and I think it's where we're going. I think is how do we balance the macro and the micro, because technology will never replace the practitioner, right? So, as a result, how do we provide information to the practitioner, right, at the macro level that can validate, what their plan is with each individual, right? Because that's ultimately what you want to know is what I'm doing working for this person or not, because we all know there's outliers, and we see it in prescription medicine. I mean, I don't know the stat offhand, but it used to be 40% of prescriptions actually work. Right. And a lot of it is because there's so much human variability. Right. And so how do we test against the assumptions we have of what we should do with each person from a movement standpoint?
Yeah. I remember even when I was in school on anatomy tests, or anatomy exams, one of the things that they told us was they can't ask you where does X muscle insert on whatever bone, because you could in theory write any answer and it could be correct, because 99% of the time it inserts at this point, but there's always outliers, and maybe the cadaver that you were working on had that outlier, and so your studies showed that, but it's not the individual approach is always needed. But at the same time, I think people are not all that different. We're very different, but not as different as we think we are. So it's almost this, we get too much information from the testing, but the output that we're going to do or the treatment might not even be that different. Does that make sense? Yeah.
No, I totally makes sense. I think this is where we get into at the end of the day, if you work with people, right, you're in the compliance game, period. It's all, you're in compliance. How do you help people be more consistent with their habits? And that's a big value of technology, right? Think about wearables. I wear an Oura ring, right? I'm pretty good at math, so I can subtract 10 p.m. from 6 a.m. to know I did 8 hours of sleep. So why do I have an Oura ring? Well, it helps kind of really support some of the habit changes I have into deeper metrics, right? And I think it's the same way with movement. How can you measure movement, in a way that, is constantly validating or challenging these habits you do so you can be more consistent, either consistent with good habits or consistent in extinguishing the bad ones, right? And I think to your point, technology may not change what you do, but at the very least, it should change the compliance of what you or others do.
Yeah, I agree with that. I had the same, I also wear an Oura ring and I've worn one for several years now. And I wouldn't say that I learn all that much from it now because I think it's been 4 or 5 years. But at the beginning, I've always been a good sleeper. It was more of a curiosity thing for me. But I was more on point with my sleep right at the beginning because I didn't want to wake up, check my score, and it's a shitty score. So I would change my behavior to not see a bad score. And I would, if I wore an Apple Watch or those things, I would want to get those badges of you hit your step goal, you were active for X amount of time today. Like the gamification of it, I think, helps a lot with just the compliance aspect, which is far and away the most important.
Yeah, and you pick up, I think, big rocks from some of those. I mean, for me personally, stopping eating 3 hours before bedtime, was a big rock, that, in a way, Aura keeps me accountable towards, because I know my sleep quality changes when I don't do that. And I think that alone is the value of any technology, is like, how can we use that to support and identify those larger habits, right? Not the habits of, well, is that multifidi or rector spini? Like, I'm not sure, right? It's more like, hey, what are the bigger movements or habits that need to be reinforced or need to be extinguished? Because I think with higher functioning individuals, sometimes they're afraid to let things go that they believe got them there, right? And they also have to identify, hey, what got me here, may not keep me here, right? And so as we age, our needs change. So how do you use technology to identify different movements that are needed as your body changes?
That's a great point. For me, that was exactly the thing that Aura did for me, was kind of calling me out on my own bullshit, where I had read the research and I knew the stuff that, caffeine too close to bedtime impacts your sleep, whether or not you can have an espresso and go straight to sleep, which I'm that person. I can have a coffee, fall asleep, no issue. But due to the ring, it quantifies that data and says, hey, you sleep noticeably worse when you have coffee too close to bedtime. So then I stopped doing that against my, it on paper, but you don't know it for real. And so I'm sure this happens with athletes all the time. It's like, oh, well, I always have McDonald's before game day because that's just my ritual since I was 7 years old. That's what we always did. And, that might not be the thing that you should be doing as you get into the pros and the higher levels.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I think another aspect of this too is that you're someone who can look at this data, understand it, and then utilize it. But it can also be very overwhelming. The Oura Ring alone provides a lot of data. And if you've got an Oura Ring and a Whoop strap and an Apple Watch and a polar heart rate monitor, and some people go crazy with these things, and then you're overwhelmed by this data. But then again, it's like, well, what do you do with that? One, can you even interpret it? And then two, how do you actually act upon it? So in some ways, I feel for some people, it is actually causing more harm than good for them.
Yeah, and there's a lot of research around that anxiety that's created from information. I've got several high-functioning friends and colleagues that don't wear wearables because it affected how they sleep, because, they're not sleeping well, so they check their wearable, tells them they're not sleeping well, that stresses them out, so they try to sleep well, and they don't, right? It's this nasty, vicious cycle. I think the key to a lot of the data is just kind of breaking it down into steps and layers, right? And not trying to achieve or improve everything at once. It's just picking one habit or one variable to, learn from and implement, right? At the end of the day, I think the goal of any of these things are to create or extinguish habits, right? And, just like trying to change 10 habits at once, it'll never happen, right? So really staying focused of why do I have a wearable? Why am I doing movement screening? It's like, okay, well, at the end of the day, it's to change one thing. And once you change that one thing, then you want to change one more thing, right? And so I think it's trying to correlate the goals and the habits with the data and information you're looking at.
I think to even expand on that is that sometimes it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy of you wake up, you have a bad score, and you're like, I'm not going to have a good workout today. My score was low. It's going to be shitty.
Yes.
I'm going to take the day off. And if you're a pro athlete and it's game day, you don't get to move your workout to the next day. It's game day, you got to perform. So have you seen that at all with any of the athletes you've worked at where they've had to kind of ditch the tech just because it would get in their head about performance on game days?
Yeah, particularly I think a challenge is in baseball where you're playing every day, and it's a very cognitive, mental, game, perhaps one of the most cognitive mental games out there. And, I think that is a challenge. I think I think that's where, there has to be a healthy perspective that this is information and it's not, all of it is not 100% factual and accurate. Right? To say that you can only perform well when you sleep well, right? That's a hard rule. That's just not true. Right. And so, I think the other thing to look at is, back to your initial comments around macro, micro, it's so much more important to look how you sleep over a month than how you sleep for a given day or even week. Right. And so, I think that's the other key is everybody when looking at information should be more concerned with macro trends, as opposed to daily, stresses, because the body's not really going to change that much on a daily basis, but it will start to be impacted over a month.
Yeah, great point. And this is why I also have clients weigh in daily for the purpose of, weight changes every single day. And so if you weigh yourself on Saturday morning, you don't weigh yourself all week, and then you weigh yourself next Saturday morning, you may be up a pound or up 2 pounds, but your weight trend was actually down that week. But because you didn't have more data points, you don't know that, and so you get discouraged and overreact, and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So it almost kind of becomes counter to what I was just saying about having too much data, where it's almost like the more data we have, the better we can kind of assess what's going on. It's I think maybe more of the way that we consume that data or the emotional attachment to that data, perhaps, where we just need to kind of the numbers are the numbers. They are not who I am as a human being. They're just the numbers. You use them and then, move on with yourself. Very
well said. Yeah. The numbers are what they are. They're not dictating who we are as a human being. That's very well said. I think, the other piece you said is emotional attachment. It's a big issue with data, right? Is, and you see it in testing, right? People are, obsessed with a bench outcome or a 40-yard dash outcome, right? And there's an emotional attachment there, as opposed to, something more global of, how do you move as a whole? I mean, we've come up with all these great markers, for measuring recovery and stress and performance. Resting heart rate's still the best one, so that's a perfect example of it's nice to have all this data, but I think there's also just singular metrics that are more global that we can use.
When you were working as a strength coach in the universities, were you, or did you work with football players?
Oh yeah.
And so did you find that leading up to the combine, they would get hyper obsessed about combine numbers versus their ability to actually play football? The bench press is one of the tests in the combine, reps of 225 pounds for anyone who doesn't know. But in no part of a football game will you lie down on your back and bench press a barbell. So it's it's a good thing to just generalize your strength, but it doesn't mean that you're a good football player. Would you find players who get hyper focused on these tests and forget to actually work on their football skills?
Yeah, and I think a big part of that, right, is there's a financial reward to it. There's a very strong incentive, right, that drives you to obsess about those things. So it's very challenging. And there's the 225 bench test you mentioned. The other thing is, how often are you going to see an offensive lineman sprint 40 yards all out in one straight line, right? Never.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of tests that aren't really representative or advantageous for them as a football player. But I think, like all of us, financial incentives are one of the more strong, ways to incentivize someone to change or focus on habits, right? And what's that saying? Be careful what you measure, right? And so there's, a lot of risk in, which data and metrics you choose.
Is that somewhere that you perhaps see Sparta Performance getting into, is starting to change the way that athletes are evaluated entering the pro game and using more relevant movement analytics as opposed to just these standard strength tests and athletic tests that we've used since forever?
Yeah, I think in general, this concept of developing a movement vital sign is something we really seek to implement within sports and military, because a lot of these tests, there's two problems. One, they're done once or twice a year, right? And so with that assumption, your body only changes once or twice a year, right? I think the other challenge is some of those metrics, like we discussed, 40, 225 bench test, are not great metrics to measure your movement health either, right? So, how can we replace that with something quick, frequent, that you can do just as often as weighing in, but also has, enough robustness to apply to everybody, right? We use the analogy internally of a blood test, right? Best part about a blood test is you get one draw, and whether that's looking at diabetes or cancer or, a host of other issues, that one blood draw is pulling so much data, that allows you to have this panel of metrics that apply to almost any condition, right? So what if we could do that for movement, where you're doing a quick assessment with a host of metrics and numbers, that allows you to address whatever goals or condition that individual is looking to improve.
Yeah, and I would even imagine it would be way more helpful, because if you can have good movement patterns, you are less likely, probably, to get injured, which is a huge part of being a pro athlete, is just being healthy for longer. And especially when you're getting into the pros, we see guys all the time who get injured late in their college season, who drop drastically in the draft rankings, because why would a pro team want to sign that guy? He's already injured before you even get him. And so, it sounds so crude to say, but it's the truth of the matter. So if we can get better at evaluating these, again, on the macro level, it would help a lot. What would a test like this look like?
Yeah, so I think, a lot of times we try to look at tests that have limited skill, right? Because, trying to avoid the combine analogy of, we don't want people training for the test, right? And the more specific the test is, right, the more skill starts to get involved, right? And that not only tries to limit the skill and the learning effect, but it also allows you to better compare, against others, your similar gender, occupation, age. And so that's, the other value. And so one of the two tests we kind of started with was, one is the balance, right? Because balance is a great predictor of a host of conditions, but it's also pretty basic. Can you stand on 2 feet? Can you stand on one leg, right? And, how can you balance, right? Are you shifting left to right, heel to toe, right? If you do get off balance, how finely can you correct? All these different points behind a balance, and that postural stability is just the most foundational human movement. Basically, it's the most foundational human movement screen there is. The other one we look at is more from a dynamic perspective, is a jump, right? And from a vertical jump standpoint, how can you, express force rapidly? And how do you express force rapidly? Is it more eccentrically when you load? Is it more concentrically? And again, we want to make it as real and free as possible, so we don't put your hands on your hips or enforce all these different rules. You can only go down to this height when you jump and all these sorts of things. It's like, hey, get on a plate, a force plate, jump as high as you can vertically. And whether it's a balance or a jump, a force plate is one of the more granular devices in terms of capturing a lot of data. So when you do a balance, for example, generates in 20 seconds 1 million data points, right? And so that allows you to capture this information and create these panels of metrics that apply to different people and different goals, right? But that balance and jump are both very limited in the skill ability, and that's where they provide value. And the less instruction that's required, the better, because you want I think movement is very artistic, right? You want the person to express a balance or a jump in their own way, right? What we call a movement signature. That's how you move. And the more things we try to force or impress on it, the more we change and get a false signal of how that individual moves.
Yeah, that makes total sense, because the test wouldn't be testing how high your vertical jump is or how long you can balance, or maybe it would be like bouts of balance, getting off balance, but it would be about how you do it. And that's not something that you can test, because you can't see, feel, evaluate that on your own with your own two eyes. Like the force plate is picking up all these tiny little movements, adjustments and whatnot, and they're unconscious movements. You don't do them. Like, you don't know that you press your big toe in and then you shift your weight this way or whatever, right? It just happens. Exactly. And that's a brilliant idea. I really like that a lot.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It's looking at the qualitative aspects. We talked about like the aura, right? In that it's not measuring just the duration of sleep. It's measuring the stages, the onset, right? The restlessness, all these, qualitative aspects within that 8-hour, 6-hour sleep window. In the same way, when we do a balance or a jump, it's not looking at how long you balance for or how high you jump. Those are just the goals, the outcomes, right? We're looking at how those outcomes are achieved. And I always get asked from an athlete standpoint, well, who's the best athlete, right? That's because we've worked with, dozens of pro teams and hundreds of colleges. That's everybody's first question when it comes to sports. And my answer is, what's the best painting? Because it's an art, right? It's the qualitative aspect. And, athletes approach movement and use their own solution to that problem.
Yeah, I think that's something that people who are not involved in sports don't quite understand that often, is that athletes are very good at what they do, but that doesn't necessarily make them good at other things. A hockey player is really great at skating. They're probably not good at sprinting because of the exact reason that they're good at skating. They will try and sprint like they skate, and that is not efficient, and vice versa, a sprinter to a skater. And a baseball player throws in a certain way, and like that's great, but it is horrendous for their elbow and their shoulder. But their goal is not to have the healthiest elbow and shoulder. Their goal is to throw a baseball as fast as they can. And so these sports become hyper specialized, which is fine, and it's part of what it is, but doesn't necessarily make it healthy. They're very good at what they do and probably not very good at a lot of other things. They might be able to pick it up faster than average because they just have a general sense of body awareness and body control, but that doesn't make one good at all things.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And so now, using these tests, you collect a lot of data points, and this is done through the force plate and through AI to classify these things. What are some of the, like, these buckets of movements or these larger classifications of movements, if you can sort of speak to that as to general movement patterns or deficiencies or classifications, if you will, and what are the major differences in how you go about solving those issues?
Yeah, at least at a kind of a general level, one of the ways we try to break it down from a balance standpoint is, think about bottoms up versus top down, because balance has a structural component, and I'm simplifying here, like a structural component of just how strong, how stable let's say your ankle is, right? But then there's a neural component as well, in that if you get off balance, how well do you correct back to that original, position, right? If you think about a sports car, right? If you barely move the wheel, it's the driving wheel. You're basically going to, veer much more quickly than something that's not a high performance car. So, looking at top down, bottom up, starts to create different grouping of some individuals are poor at both, right? They have poor stability, maybe weak lower body. And when they do get off balance, they can't correct very well. And then there's individuals that have, really strong, ability to stabilize, but they're like a 2x4. When they get off balance, they don't correct, right? Or, on the other hand, another bucket is great neural ability, but not a lot of structural stability. So they're like a noodle. They just fall over, right? So those are three kind of general buckets looking at, okay, how well is the neural piece, your ability to correct, what we call control, and then how good is your bottoms up stability, what we call sway, and how do those two interact to create different clusters or groupings. On the jump side, we look at, three major variables. One is what we call load, your eccentric ability. We look at explode, your concentric ability, your ability to basically rebound after you're stretched. And then we look at drive, which is that duration of force production. And so the interaction of those three areas creates different signatures. Offensive linemen are really strong eccentrically, right? They have to be. They get paid to not move, right? And then you've got baseball players that have really poor concentric strength. They're not very stiff, because if you're a pitcher and you're stiff, you can't rotate that well, right? So there's these different signatures that the variables interact with to create different groupings for individuals, not only of what they do well, but what they can use to enhance, or to your point earlier, maintain their health.
So in an athlete, it would be trying to specialize them more for their sport. If a pitcher comes to you and they are too stiff, then you're working on getting them looser, for a lack of a better term, because they need to be able to do that for their sport. But a regular person who's not an athlete, an elderly person, let's say, wouldn't necessarily need that. They kind of need to be a little bit more well-balanced. So you start with, say again, they're too stiff. So you start by loosening them up. And it's not trying to get as loose as a person who is a pitcher, but try to get a little bit more movement so that their foot can actually articulate and move on the force plate as they balance, and help them with regular life, or start to generate power, whatever the case may be. Is that correct?
Absolutely. It's really identifying what those goals are. If you're an elderly person versus, a baseball player, identifying what those goals are and then correlating it with the appropriate metrics, right? And that's where, okay, we want to work on these metrics. And to your point, if someone's stiff, maybe we need to make them less stiff, or maybe we just need to make sure to maintain where they are, because a lot of us that are fortunate enough to be healthy, it's a different goal. It's to maintain that level of health in that sweet spot, because as you continue to try to perform at a higher level, it's also more likely you become more at risk. And a lot of the data we've looked at least with athletes, the number one predictor of injury risk is jump height. If you jump higher, you're at a higher risk. If you drive your car faster, it's more likely to wear down, right? So, how do we kind of balance that need for performance with the need for longevity?
Does that jump height metric go across all sports? Like in a sport like baseball, you're not, I guess maybe if you're catching, you're not really jumping all that much. A sport like hockey, you're not jumping, but is it just the ability? Like, what is it about jump height that would lead to that?
I think it's more that it's a general measurement of your stretch shortening cycle, which all athletes use to some extent. It may not be, to your point, in a jump specifically, but when we published a research article around elbow injuries, the largest predictor was jump height, because in essence, you're jumping off the mound to throw a baseball as hard as you can. And so the more explosive you are, the more velocity you're likely to generate when you throw. The more velocity you use, right, the more stress there is on the elbow and the shoulder. And so it's really trying to balance those two areas of how do you perform at a higher level, but in a way that allows you to do it repeatedly.
Right. So it's probably more of somewhat of a trade-off where your body includes explosivity, but at the cost of stability. Kind of like a sports car analogy is great. A sports car is not as reliable, but it'll drive really fast, versus a Honda Civic, not going to be that fast, but it'll last you forever, kind of thing.
Yeah, and sometimes we even use the analogy of the stock market or stock portfolios, right? How much risk are you willing to tolerate with your investments, right? Because if you've got a long term and you're a young person and you've got a stock portfolio, maybe you're okay tolerating a lot of risk because you got a lot of years. Someone that's more elderly may want less risk, right? So it also, you really have to determine, the athlete, the organization, how much risk you're willing to tolerate, from a performance versus health standpoint.
Right. No, it makes a lot of sense. That's a great analogy, actually. But it's also just has to be related to the task, like we said before already. Athletes are very good at what they do, doesn't make them good at other things, and it's not the thing that most general people should be striving for. You shouldn't strive to move like a baseball pitcher, because that would not be good for most people in your day-to-day life. But having Absolutely. Said that, these kind of tests in your company don't really cater to regular people in sort of like consumer area right now. So people can't just go and get a force plate test and like do all this stuff. So how can people start to think about their biomechanics in ways that they move and notice deficiencies maybe in their day-to-day life that they can start to try and fix, if that's something that you've thought about at all?
Yeah. No, you're right. Most of Sparta's work right now is with organizations, to help them take care of the movement health for the people within the organization, whether it's a sports team, a military unit, or a healthcare system, and so one of the things that we're always trying to do is, how can we continue to reach and help more people, which, healthcare is one of the better ways to do that. And then also sharing information we find, through some of the education channels we have, like blogs or certain articles and research, and really trying to piece together what movement health means and what are some really basic steps to be aware of that can improve, your general movement capabilities. Right.
So in a perfect world, people are able to test themselves, and then that test would lead to some type of training program tailored to whatever the test found. And then you would retest after 8 weeks or 12, however long that training program lasts, and then see what worked, what didn't work, and then continue to evaluate from there.
Yeah, and I think that because the test only takes, 2 minutes, I think the testing frequency can be even in more at a higher, on a weekly or even monthly cadence, so really is a way for the individual to, associate what they're doing or what they're not doing, and continue to keep them engaged. We found that it's particularly important in the rehab process, right? Which can be a frustrating, a lot of times gray area for individuals. Am I getting better? How much better? When am I going to be ready? Like, when is this pain going to go away? And so having these frequent testing in the rehab process as well can be a helpful insight, not only from a compliance standpoint for that individual to continue to come in for therapy, but also from just an emotional standpoint that they are tracking towards their goal, whether it's reduced pain, improved function. And that's ultimately what allows them, to complete their rehab program in a way that's safe, but also as expeditiously as possible.
And you would probably see quicker changes in someone who's going through a rehab program as actual tissues and structures are changing, versus a healthy person who's just looking to optimize performance. You might not see changes on a weekly basis, right?
100%. Yeah. And I think that's the valuable part of the rehab process is you're able to see, faster changes in a time that's probably a little bit more frustrating for the individual. Right. And so you get more of that instant feedback in a time when you may not feel like you're getting a lot of gratification.
Yeah.
Doing things like band walks, wall sits, not exciting stuff, right?
Yeah.
And you're like, wow, like how much do I have to do? Is this even helpful, right? Like, should I even come back? Can I just do this at home, right?
No, you took the words right out of my mouth. Like anyone who's been through a major injury or a surgery and had to go through the physio exercise, rehab, and all that stuff, it's incredibly boring, and it's incredibly slow, and it just wears you down because you feel like it just still hurts every single time I come. I feel like I'm not really doing anything, but this physio person keeps telling me to do this stuff, and like, okay, I guess I'll keep doing it. And then you start to like not believe in it. And then you do it with less intensity. You don't do your homework. And then it's just kind of like this downward cycle. And the physiotherapists and they're like, well, what the hell? Like, just do the stuff that we said, like it's supposed to work. And you're like, yeah, but we've been doing it for 6 weeks and I didn't see any change because we don't have a proper way to test it. Right. So yeah, I didn't even really consider that.
Yeah, no, you're so right. I mean, I think that's the typical journey is you get given this homework that's, helpful, repetitive, tedious, and effective, right? So all wrapped into one. And like, so how do you ultimately, give some of that positive reinforcement that it's working, right? And that just stay the course. And that's where there's an opportunity to have some sort of objective marker in there.
Yeah. So it would drastically, in my opinion, improve recovery efforts across any injury. And then like the financial aspect, because we always have to bring that in, would be patients or clients stick with the program longer, get better, give positive referrals, do more sessions, et cetera, to actually get better, which feeds more into it. And so like everybody wins with this. And it doesn't
100%.
Even sound like it's really all that expensive. I'm sure there'll be like some upfront cost to get the equipment and whatever, but after that, it's going to pay for itself very quickly.
Yeah. I mean, that's where you want to live, right? Is in those win-win situations where, the person doing rehab, feels like they're getting better. That's a win. They do get better. That's obviously the biggest win. The therapist, the coach, the practitioner, they get to see a higher level of compliance, right? So they're winning. The business owner, the organization leader, has better business outcomes, right? Whether that's referrals or direct, revenue, right? So everybody really wins, as long as we can rally folks around a central kind of movement health score.
One thing you mentioned earlier that I wanted to come back to as we start to wind down is that technology will never replace the practitioner. Yet we're seeing a huge surge in AI for consumers as of late. And so your company included will use a lot of technology to dictate training outcomes, treatment outcomes, et cetera, with far more data than any human could ever evaluate or even comprehend. So in your opinion, how much, I don't think, I'm with you that the data or the technology will never replace the practitioner, but it's going to get pretty close. How much of the practitioner do you think that the data is going to replace?
Yeah, I think it's the practitioner role is really going to shift more. I think as practitioners, originally, a lot of us were trained that it was our role to assess, and then also, prescribe and treat, whether that's exercises, medications. And I think what'll shift with technology is it will allow the practitioner to spend less time and energy on the assessment and screening part and more time on the interpretation and the prescription and ultimately the relationship with the athlete, patient, whoever it may be, so that it'll shift more, which I think is a good thing, because ultimately what you don't want is subjective choosing on what screen to do. It's not like you go into a doctor and they say, you know what, I don't want to do an MRI today. I kind of feel like we do a CT, let's do a CT scan, and so I think that kind of flippancy is, where we've got to move from a practitioner standpoint away from less about, hey, my expertise is in the screening. That's where technology can capture more data and crowdsource more effectively. And practitioners, that will free them up to be more on the outcomes, the treatment side of things, which is a mix of both technical and emotional expertise. And that's where AI is not going to play. That's where tech's not going to play in that emotional space.
Yeah, agreed. I'm very very high on the human aspect, the human input to this, because that's the thing that can never be replaced. I think that AI can, or maybe not yet, but very soon, not close, not far away, write better training programs, screen people better, listen to a voice, and tell when someone's lying, or evaluate their pain better by the tone of their voice. Not lying, but you know what I mean, where a patient will come in and kind of over exaggerate their symptoms, and it's not even conscious, but it's like a subconscious kind of thing that, whatever, you know what I'm talking about as a doctor. But the AI can pick up on that faster, and it can have the the Rolodex of every single condition that has ever existed, times every single medication and treatment and testing that's ever existed, and then pair those two together, snap of fingers. Like I heard someone say it the other day, AI is, imagine you had a friend that read every single book, website, article, scientific study ever and remembered all of it. That's AI. Yeah. And so like you can't beat that, right? But you can be more human than that and deal with the person's emotions and, understand what the family implications are, and maybe their personal financial situation or whatever the downstream effects are of what's going on with them. But, trying to beat the computer is a losing game.
Yeah. And I think it's repositioning and reframing as practitioners how we look at it. We shouldn't be scared of it. It should be, actually an opportunity that we can move more towards, actually working with people, because there's less time spent on the capturing and assessment piece.
Right. Something that we experience here in Canada, maybe a lot more, it's more talked about anyways, it seems, is that doctors are so bogged down by the administrative aspect of their job. So much charting, so much input, so much paperwork that they can't treat enough patients or see enough patients, and it's like 7-minute appointments and this craziness. And like if that can just be taken out, then doctors can see more people can get helped, and everybody wins. Again, win-win scenario.
Yeah, and I think there's a big, from practitioners, whether it's doctors, coaches, trainers, there's a burnout issue too, right? Mm-hmm. And a lot of it is because of the administrative burden. So I think, the other hope is that technology can offload people to have more time, right? At the end of the day, that's what technology should do. It should give people more time. Because if you have more time, right, that can be spent either with the patient, with the client, with the athlete, or it can be spent on your own self-care, spending time with family or sleeping more or whatever that may be to just, feel better, and have a better life experience for yourself.
Yeah. Couldn't agree more. Very well said. And I think we'll get there, but I think currently we're just so overwhelmed, bringing this whole full circle by the amount of data and information and knowledge and stuff that's out there, that it's like, I'm just so bombarded by all the numbers that people can't separate it. And it's actually wasting more time than it's creating. But I think we're going to get there.
Yeah. It's just, we're just in that transition period. And for anybody, right, transition periods are never, smooth, right? There's a resettling that has to occur.
Yeah. We'll get there. Humans will prevail. I'm team human. So that's, well, we'll see. Who knows?
Yeah.
Phil, thanks so much for being here. I know we're a little tight on time. Is there any last message that you kind of want to leave the people with here before we close off?
Oh, thank you, Daniel. I think I think the message, for at least from our standpoint, is, how important and impactful movement is, because it really underlies every condition as a cause or as a result, right? And I think it's an exciting time to think about movement as medicine, if you will, right? And something to not only keep you from, negative health conditions, but also to allow you to, maintain a higher quality of life, each additional year. Because that's also part of the challenge, right? Is folks have injuries or pain, and it really affects other conditions, and other areas start to creep in, whether it's diabetes, cardiovascular. And, I think so. That's the exciting piece for us, is that this movement health area is an exciting and really global opportunity to help, folks have a better life experience.
Beautiful. I 100% agree with that. Of course, I'm biased, but, the ability to move is something that's where it's taken for granted far too much. And anyone who's had that taken away from them due to injury, surgery, health condition, like, that when you're, sat in the couch and you can't move, you'd want nothing more than just to be able to get up and go to the bathroom by yourself, and these simple things. So the longer that we can keep that, and the more that we can keep that across the population, the better off we're all going to be. So thank you for doing what you do and on that macro level, and because I think it's going to make a big downstream effect for all of us.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for having me, Daniel. Yeah.
Thank you very much. The contact info for Sparta Performance, people want to get in contact, or social media for yourself. I'll throw it on the show notes, but rattle it off here so we have it.
Yeah. So our website is spartascience.com. And, the Twitter handle is Sparta Science as well. My Twitter handle is, Dr. Phil Wagner. And so that's, best way to kind of learn and see some of the information we're putting out there in the hopes of, really trying to help folks around this movement health side of things.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for being here. I'll throw all that stuff in the show notes. Check it out if you're interested for more information. If you have an organization, healthcare, sports team, anything of the like, military, and that's it. Get outside, move your body, because that's the thing that's going to keep you better than anything else. If you can't do anything else, just go outside and move as much as you can. Share this podcast with whoever you feel would benefit from it. Like, share, subscribe on all the places that you listen to, Instagram, all those things. Daniel Yoris, and that's it. Go outside, be a good person. We'll see you next time.